Hello, I'm Emily, or also known as uncretive artist. I know my username is spelled in a funny way, but the normal version wasn't available as a username anymore. So this is my first real video here on YouTube. I'm usually more active over on Instagram, but a lot of my followers there have been asking me for all kinds of tutorials and longer videos, so I thought I'd just give this one a try. But because I don't have any actual experience with making YouTube videos, I thought it would be best to start with a simple process video. I'm also not super comfortable with voiceovers because accents do exist, but I still wanted to give you all some insight into my drawing and thought process. Also, disclaimer, I'm no expert, this is just my way of doing things, so don't take this as professional advice, please. As you may have noticed, I'm using Procreate and I showed the canvas size at the beginning for anyone who's interested in that. And if you've been following me on Instagram for a while, you also might have already guessed it, I'm using my own sketching brush for this drawing. I'll put the link in the description in case anyone's interested. At this point, I'm already done with the base guidelines, but I still want to explain why and how I use them, because there's always a bit of confusion about this. A lot of people assume it's a version of the Loomis method, and it might be. I honestly have no idea if it is, but using the full Loomis method isn't really my style, because I'm impatient and I don't want to draw too many guidelines at the beginning of every portrait sketch. The guidelines I do use have multiple purposes, but it's not really a strict guide for proportions. One of the main reasons I use them is positioning. It helps me figure out the size of the portrait in relation to the canvas, but it also helps me with the angle and size of the head. The other reason might be familiar for some artists, but those guidelines help me overcome the fear of a blank canvas, so to say. By now it's just a routine I use almost every time I draw a portrait. Yes, to an extent the lines can also help with proportions, but I spend way too less time on drawing these sketch lines for them to be of any accurate use, so please don't take them too seriously. Let's talk about my sketching process. It usually consists of 3 stages. You've already seen the first one, in which I just draw some base guidelines. After that we have the first sketch, which I'm doing right now. It's where I draw the facial features and the hair, but in a less detailed and more rough version. And I also adjust some features and proportions later in his face. The last step, if I don't decide to color it, is the refined sketch, or some people also call it line art. Even though I'm not sure if this technically counts as line art or not, you can decide it for yourself if you want. As you can see, I'm also using a reference, which I found on Pinterest. It's always helpful to use one, especially for proportions. But whether I'm sticking more closely to the actual image or if I just take some inspiration from it really depends on both the reference itself and, to an extent, my mood. I'm usually not very good with hairstyles, so I use a reference for that almost all of the time. At this point, let's talk about the actual drawing process. I usually try not to think too much about the first sketch, unless I'm doing some traditional sketching, because I will refine it later anyway, and I also tend to make more changes in this phase. So my main focus at this stage is to just get the base features and the proportions down, and if I don't like something, I can either make small changes with the liquify tool, or just erase and redraw parts I don't like. You can see that I'm currently using the liquify tool to adjust some areas. It's especially useful for shifting larger areas around, but I don't recommend using it too much on line art since it can get blurry if used too much, speaking from personal experience. I also use the transform tool, at least I think that's the name for it, to shift my drawing around the canvas and make size adjustments, because I do tend to draw in one corner instead of the middle of the canvas. Regarding my layers, I usually use one layer for every sketching phase, starting with the base guidelines as the bottom layer. Before the refined sketch, I usually reduce the opacity for both base guidelines and the first sketch to somewhere around 50 to 60%. This is also the time where I do realize that there is indeed the option to zoom in and I get started on the refined sketch or line art or whatever you want to call it. For this part you've seen me change the sketching color to a darker blue. It's almost black, so there's a bit more contrast and I can see the difference between the first and refined sketch better. I also decreased the size of my brush. I do have pre-saved settings for this just to make the changes faster and easier for me. So now we're at the point where I'm just focusing on the line work. While sketching, I always try to keep my brush strokes relatively loose and relaxed, especially when I'm doing the hair. In this stage you will also see me erasing, or rather undoing, a lot more lines because I'm not happy with them. But in general, I think this is probably the most relaxing part of the whole drawing process for me, because I already laid all the groundwork at this point. So instead of explaining every single line I draw, I want to use the rest of the video to talk about some sketching related questions you asked me about. One person wants to know if there's a routine I follow while sketching or if I just wing it. And this question probably answers itself after the video, but I kind of do have a routine that I mentioned for my general sketching approach. Regarding the individual facial features, I don't really have a set routine or order. I usually start with the nose or the eyes and then continue with the mouth, because it's just easier for me proportion-wise, though this might change depending on the face angle. But after that, I just go with what feels right in the moment. When I was doing my first portrait ever, I tried to start with the outline of the face, but the proportions were all over the place, so I don't do that anymore because it definitely doesn't work for me. I hope that answers the question about my routine. Another person wants to know about drawing without a reference. Honestly, the best answer I can give to that is practice. Build up an understanding of facial features, anatomy and proportions, and look at a lot of different references, at least for faces, but I think it's similar with everything you want to draw from memory. For example, I couldn't draw an elephant without a reference, at least not a good looking one, because I have maybe drawn one elephant in my entire life. But I think I've seen and drawn enough faces to draw at least a somewhat recognizable person. At least I had people comment on some of my from memory drawings that they looked like their ex-girlfriends or their best friends. Just remember, there's nothing wrong with using a reference, and that most of the time it's incredibly helpful to use one. The next question I want to answer is about art styles and how to find your own, because I do get that question a lot. I don't really like to think of it as finding your art style, but rather developing it, because it's not something that just happens. Your art style develops over time, and it also changes over time, because we are all constantly learning new stuff. So my first tip for working on your style would be to study anatomy. Whether you are going for a more realistic or a more cartoonish style, the basics are all the same. And as people like to say, you need to learn the rules before you can break them. My next tip would be to study other artists' work. It doesn't mean you should steal other people's work, but it can help to look at other styles. I always get inspired when I look at some of my favorite artists' work. That doesn't mean I copy it, but maybe you like the approach one artist has when drawing hair, and you get inspired by that, and it helps you find your own version of it. And last but not least, you just need to practice a lot, because you don't develop an art style without experimenting and drawing a lot. I definitely tried multiple ways of drawing eyes, mouths, etc. before I found the ones that work best for me. And nothing is set in stone, so this can definitely change over time. I also learned that it's kind of impossible to not have an art style, because we all draw in our own unique way. But I guess what people are looking for when they ask this question is an easily recognizable and reliable art style that they can work with. Personally, I didn't think I had an art style until I started posting on Instagram. I only realized it when people were commenting stuff like, "Hey, I really like your art style," and I looked back at my feed and thought, I guess I kind of do have an art style, I just didn't notice it that way before, or I just didn't draw enough before to notice it. So I hope this answers the question about art styles. The last question I'm going to answer in this video is about alignment. This person asked about how to align eyes in portraits because they struggle with it. And yes, drawing aligned eyes can be tricky. I think we all struggle with it sometimes, at least I do. But I think the most useful thing to do is to kind of draw both eyes at the same time. It's easier to figure out the eye positioning if you focus on both of them in relation to each other, instead of drawing the one perfect eye and then being scared to do the other one. When you draw both step by step, it's also easier to adjust the placement when it's just a few lines instead of a finished eye you don't want to mess with. Also, nothing speaks against using actual guidelines for this, so use a line to indicate where the eyes should be and use it as an orientation point to draw on. So now that the sketch is almost done, I just wanted to mention that I usually hide the layer with the base guidelines when the refined sketch is done, and I set the first sketch layer to multiply. So this is it for my first video. I hope the whole thing wasn't too boring to watch, but then you probably wouldn't be here at the end of the video, or at least I hope so. I tried to show and explain the entirety of my usual sketching process, but if there are any questions or things you'd like to know more about or stuff I didn't mention, I'd really appreciate the feedback, and if there are any questions, I'll try to answer them. I didn't include any coloring in this video because I wasn't sure how long the video would be if that part was included as well, but if you are interested in it, let me know. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching, I really appreciate it, and if you want to see more of my art, you can of course follow me here on YouTube, but I have an Instagram account and a TikTok as well, where I do post a bit more often. I have the same username there, so it should be easy to find, and I hope you have a nice day.